There are things they don't put in the brochures. You read about Buckingham Palace and you get the gold gates, the changing of the guard, the tall bearskin hats moving in perfect military lines like something out of a dream. You get the history. You get the majesty. What you don't get, what nobody warns you about, is the weight of it. Not the weight of the crown or the weight of centuries. The weight of standing still while the world moves. I know because I stood it myself for 11 years. Not at the front gates, not where the tourists press their faces against the iron and point their cameras at you like you're part of the scenery. I stood it inside, in the corridors, in the function rooms. In the spaces between the grand staircases where the carpets are so thick you can't hear your own footsteps. Where the chandeliers are so heavy they make you feel, every time you walk beneath them, that the world above you has its own gravity pulling you down. My name is Thomas Aldrin, and I'm going to tell you something that happened in the spring of 2018 that I've never told anyone in full. Not because I was ordered to stay quiet, not because there was a directive, or a protocol, or a memo with someone's signature at the bottom telling me what I could and couldn't say. I stayed quiet because I needed time to understand it myself. Because what happened that morning in the east corridor of the palace, in that long stretch of pale light between the Regency stateroom and the private drawing rooms, wasn't the kind of thing you retell over a pint and expect anyone to fully grasp. It was the kind of thing you carry. Let me set it properly, because the setting matters here. Spring arrives differently inside the palace than it does outside. Outside, you see it, the trees in St. James's Park turning green, the daffodils in the formal beds, the tourists trading their winter coats for lighter jackets and reappearing at the gates in bigger numbers than before. Out there, spring has color. Out there, spring has noise. Inside, you feel it differently. The light changes, that's the first thing. In the deep winter months, the East Corridor gets a kind of gray, thin light in the mornings, the kind that makes the gold picture frames look dull, that makes the oil paintings of long-dead kings look more haunted than regal. But in spring, especially in early April when the sun starts coming in at the right angle through the tall sash windows, the whole corridor shifts. The gold becomes gold again. The reds in the carpet deepen. The white plasterwork of the ceiling catches it and glows. It was that kind of morning, early April, a Tuesday. I had been posted to the East Corridor since 6 in the morning. Standard rotation. My station was at the far end, near the set of double doors that separated the formal corridor from the private residential passage. It was what the older guards used to call the buffer post. You were neither fully in the public ceremonial space nor in the fully private one. You were the transition point, the hinge. At that post you saw things. Not secrets. That's the wrong word for it, and I want to be precise about that because precision matters when you're talking about the palace. You didn't see secrets. You saw moments. You saw the way a space behaved when the people in it thought no one important was watching. And I was always watching. That's the job, that's the whole job distilled down to its most essential form. You watch, you observe, you register, and you do not react, not to the cold, not to the heat. Not to the long stretches of silence when an hour can go by, and the only thing you've processed is the way the light has shifted 3 degrees on the far wall. Not to anything. We trained for that stillness for months before we ever set foot inside the palace. There's a version of it they try to describe to new recruits. They tell you to imagine yourself as part of the architecture. A column, they used to say, you are a column. The room happens around you. It took me 2 years to really understand what that meant. It took one morning in April of 2018 to understand the limits of it. His name was Corporal James Whitmore. And I want to be careful here about how I describe him, because I don't want to turn him into something he wasn't. He wasn't a hero in the film sense of the word. He wasn't dramatic. He wasn't the kind of man who filled a room. He was medium height, just barely above the minimum requirement for palace duty, with a compact, solid build that suggested more about discipline than genetics. Sandy-colored hair, cut to regulation length so precisely that it looked almost architectural itself. Gray eyes, the kind of face that forgot itself in a crowd. But Whitmore had something that most of us, most of the guards I served with over 11 years, did not have in the same degree. A quality of absolute internal stillness. Not external stillness. We all had that. You train it into your muscles until it stops being a choice and starts being a reflex. But internal stillness is different. Internal stillness is the thing that doesn't flinch when someone walks up and shouts 6 inches from your ear. It's the thing that doesn't allow a private emotion to become a visible expression. It's the thing that keeps the column standing even when the room tries to shake it. I had met Whitmore 3 years before this story begins, when he was first transferred to palace interior duty from Windsor. The word that came with him from his previous station was simple and consistent, reliable, not outstanding, not exceptional, not the sort of man who'd end up in a photograph or a training manual. Just reliable. The kind of reliable that becomes invisible because it never fails. By April of 2018, Whitmore and I had shared the East Corridor rotation for the better part of 2 years. We worked well together the way that you work well with someone you don't need to talk to. You've been in the same space long enough to read the silences, to know when something is normal and when something is slightly off. We had a language that wasn't language, a slight tension in the shoulder, a barely perceptible shift of the eyes to the left, that kind of thing. And that morning at 9:30, Whitmore's eyes shifted to the left. I registered it before I understood it. That's how it always works in that job. You register first and you understand second, because if you wait to understand before you register, you've already missed the moment. The shift of his eyes, the almost imperceptible straightening of his posture. Not the formal straightening that we defaulted to when anyone of rank passed through. That was a different thing, a trained reflex, automatic as breathing. This was something else, something that came from inside rather than from muscle memory. I held my station and I tracked the corridor. The East Corridor runs approximately 40 meters from the double doors near my post to the entrance arch at the far end. At that hour on a Tuesday morning in April, it was quiet. The household staff had completed their morning rounds. The functions planned for that afternoon wouldn't begin for another 4 hours. And the only regular movement through that space at that time was the passage of senior household members and occasionally members of the royal household themselves. I clocked her at about 25 meters out. The Duchess of Cornwall. She was moving at a brisk pace, the kind of pace that signals purpose without rushing, the way people at that level of palace life always seemed to move when they had somewhere to be. She was dressed formally for a morning engagement. There was a personal secretary behind her right shoulder, and 2 paces behind that, a senior lady-in-waiting keeping pace with practiced ease. The small entourage moved the way the palace moved, with that particular quality of efficiency and composure that comes from everyone involved having done this kind of thing 1,000 times. Whitmore was at his post, 20 meters up from me on the left side of the corridor. I was at the buffer doors. Standard protocol when a member of the royal family passes through your corridor. You hold your station. You acknowledge with the appropriate formal bearing. You do not speak unless spoken to. You do not move unless required for security purposes. I held my station. I watched. The Duchess moved through the corridor at that same brisk pace, and I assumed, as I think Whitmore assumed, that this was simply a transit. A morning passage. The kind that happened perhaps 2 or 3 times a week, where a royal moved through your corridor en route to somewhere else, and your job was simply not to make yourself interesting enough to be noticed. But she stopped. She stopped at Whitmore's post. Not in the way that someone stops because they've remembered something, or because they've spotted a problem, or because they're waiting for the person behind them to catch up. She stopped deliberately, with intention. She turned toward Whitmore and she looked at him, fully, directly, in a way that was different from the standard passing glance of recognition that most royals gave the corridor guards. She said something. I was 20 meters away. I couldn't hear the specific words at that distance, not clearly. I caught the tone, measured, composed, the way she spoke in all public settings. And I caught Whitmore's response, which was what people further along the corridor would tell me about later, and what I would piece together from the accounts of 4 other people who were at various positions within earshot that morning. What I know for certain, because I heard it myself, was Whitmore's voice. Low, even, not defiant, not hostile, completely composed. And the words, which I caught only in fragments, but which were reported to me in full by a senior household aide, who was standing close enough to hear everything. I'm deeply honored to be acknowledged, Your Royal Highness, but the position I hold does not permit me to kneel outside of formal ceremony. It would mean leaving my post inadequately covered. I hope Your Royal Highness will forgive the constraint of duty. The corridor went still in the way that only that particular corridor could go still, utterly, completely, as if the building itself had paused to listen. And then the Duchess of Cornwall nodded. Once, slowly, with an expression that those who were close enough described later privately as something that resembled, and I'm using their words, not mine, respect. She continued through the corridor. Her secretary and her lady-in-waiting followed without visible reaction, which told me they had been trained for precisely this kind of moment. That the way you handle an unexpected outcome in a palace corridor is with the same composure you handle everything else. The double doors at my end of the corridor opened and closed, and the east corridor returned to its silence. I didn't move from my post. You don't, whatever you've just witnessed, whatever your internal response to it, and mine was considerable, though I won't pretend I fully understood what I was feeling at that moment, you don't move from your post. The column doesn't flinch. That's the whole thing. That's the entire foundation of what we were there to do. But I was watching Whitmore, and I noticed something that I think most people, even people who served at the palace, might have missed. He didn't exhale with relief when she was gone. He didn't shift his weight. He didn't release any kind of tension from his shoulders. His posture didn't change at all, not a degree. Not a millimeter. Because, and this is the part I needed 3 years to fully understand, he hadn't been tense. That was the remarkable thing. It wasn't that Whitmore had steeled himself for a difficult moment and come through it. It wasn't that he'd found some reserve of courage in that second and drawn on it. It was that, for Whitmore, there had been no difficult moment to overcome. He had simply said what was true in the most respectful possible way and returned to his post as though the exchange had been as routine as someone asking him for directions. That was the quality I couldn't quite name at the time. I understand it better now. It wasn't bravery. It wasn't defiance. It wasn't the theatrical courage of someone choosing the harder path and wanting credit for it. It was clarity. Whitmore had a clarity about what he was and what he was for, and what he owed to that was so complete and so settled in him that there was genuinely no conflict when it was tested. He didn't have to decide anything. He just had to be what he already was. I've spent a long time since then, a long time thinking about how rare that is. Not just in guards, not just in the palace, everywhere. The rest of that Tuesday unfolded normally. The afternoon function came off without incident. The corridor rotations continued. The evening came on slowly, the spring light fading at the windows above the formal gardens, the chandeliers winking on one cluster at a time as the natural light gave way. But by noon that day, the story had begun moving. Quietly, the way things always moved in the palace, not through announcements or formal channels, but through the small current of information that ran between staff members, through shared glances in the staff corridors, through the way someone would sit down across from you at the lunch tables in the lower staff dining hall and say, without preamble, "Did you hear about the East Corridor this morning?" I ate lunch with a colleague named Richards, Douglas Richards, 8-year veteran, currently stationed on the ground floor staterooms. And before I'd finished my first cup of tea, he'd already heard 3 different versions of what had happened. Version 1, the guard had refused a direct order and there would be consequences. Version 2, the guard had spoken so politely that no one could actually be certain whether it was a refusal at all or simply an explanation. Version 3, and this was the one Richard seemed to find most interesting, was that whoever had been present in that corridor when it happened had walked away from it feeling like they'd witnessed something, but weren't entirely sure what. I told Richard's version 2 was closest to accurate. He nodded slowly, turning his tea mug in his hands. "That's the thing about Whitmore, isn't it?" he said, not as a question, more like a conclusion. "What do you mean?" I asked. Richards thought about it for a moment. "Most blokes in that situation," he said, "they'd either panic and do something they regretted, or they'd dig in and make it bigger than it needed to be. Either way, there's a scene. There's something you have to manage afterwards." He paused. Whitmore didn't give it a scene to be. That stayed with me. It was precise in a way I wouldn't have been able to articulate myself, but when Richard said it, I knew immediately that he'd found the right words for it. Whitmore didn't give it a scene to be. By the time the afternoon shift began, I'd spoken to 4 other people who had been in or near the East Corridor that morning. a senior household aide, two members of the domestic staff who had been entering from a side passage at the far end, and a junior member of the housekeeping team who had been about 10 meters behind the Duchess's entourage when the stop occurred. Their accounts varied in small details the way all eyewitness accounts vary, the precise words, the exact position of each person, whether the personal secretary's expression changed or remained neutral throughout. But they all agreed on the shape of it, on the texture of it. The Duchess had stopped, she had said something. Whitmore had responded with complete, unhurried composure. She had continued. And the corridor, for just a moment, had been a different kind of place. Not tense, not dramatic, just weighty. The way certain moments are weighted by what they could have been but weren't. The junior housekeeper, a young woman maybe 2 years into her palace service, from somewhere in Shropshire if I'm remembering right, said something to me that I wrote down that evening in the small notebook I kept then. It wasn't that he didn't care, that's what got me. He clearly cared enormously. You could see it in how careful he was. He just cared about the right things in the right order. I've thought about that sentence a lot. Cared about the right things in the right order. By the time evening fell properly that Tuesday, the last light going off the formal gardens, the upper floors of the palace lit warmly against the darkening sky. Two things had happened that I didn't expect. The first was a request, relayed through the duty officer, that Corporal James Whitmore report to the Household Protocol Office at 9 the following morning. Not a disciplinary summons. The language of it was too neutral for that, a request, not an order. A meeting, not a hearing. But it was enough to put a different texture on the dinner table conversations in the lower staff hall that evening. The second thing was smaller, more personal, easy to miss. I was leaving through the staff exit at the end of my shift, already out of uniform, my coat collar up against the April chill that still had teeth in it after dark, when I passed Whitmore going the other direction. He was coming back in, he'd stepped outside briefly, as we sometimes did when we had a few minutes between the formal end of a shift and the debrief check, just for the air. I stopped, he stopped. We were the kind of colleagues who didn't need to fill silence, but I felt something wanted to be said. Not about the morning, not specifically, just something. "You all right?" I asked. He looked at me, those gray eyes completely level. "Yes," he said. He meant it, that was the thing. He completely meant it. "That was," I started. "It was Tuesday," he said, quietly. Not dismissive, not deflecting, just placing it accurately in the order of things. And then he went back inside. And I stood there in the April dark for a moment, feeling the weight of 11 years of this job settle around me like a coat I'd grown so used to wearing I'd almost stopped feeling it. And I thought, that's the thing, that's the whole thing right there. It was Tuesday. Not a landmark, not a test, not a moment he'd been building toward or that he'd need to recover from. It was a Tuesday in April, and he'd done his job, and now the shift was over, and tomorrow there would be another shift. That was the clarity. That was the thing I'd been trying to name all day. I went home that night to my flat in Pimlico, a 12-minute walk from the palace, which sounds convenient and mostly was, except for the fact that it made it harder to ever fully leave the job behind. You'd walk the same streets, you'd pass the same landmarks, the place had a gravity. I made tea I didn't really want, and I sat at the kitchen table, and I thought about Whitmore. Not with worry, not with the anxious wondering that some of the others seemed to feel, whether there would be consequences, whether the meeting the next morning would go a certain way, whether the morning's exchange would leave a mark on his record somewhere that would matter later. I thought about him with something closer to a quiet kind of wonder. Because I had served for 11 years, and in those 11 years I had been in difficult moments, not many, but some. Moments where something unexpected happened, and you had to make a choice in less time than it takes to register that a choice is being made. And every single time, without exception, I had felt it. The spike, the internal lurch, the half-second of something that wasn't quite fear but was related to it. The thing that you then had to manage, had to compress back down into the composure the job required. Every single time, without exception. Whitmore, standing in that corridor that Tuesday morning, apparently had not felt it. Or if he did, and I've considered this possibility, he had so thoroughly integrated the management of it into his baseline state that it produced no observable effect. Not even the small ones. Not even the ones you'd only catch if you were watching very closely and knew precisely what to look for. I was watching very closely. I knew precisely what to look for. There was nothing. I sat at that kitchen table for a long time. And eventually I thought, some people are built for certain things in a way that goes past training, past experience, past the accumulation of years. Some people are built for it from somewhere deeper and older than any of that. Whitmore was built for this. And the palace, that extraordinary, strange, weight-bearing place, had found him. There are exactly two ways a summons to the protocol office can feel when you've been on palace interior duty long enough to know the difference. The first way is the administrative way. That's when something procedural needs to happen, a rotation change, a record update, a cross-check on something that's purely routine dressed in formal language, because that's how the palace dresses everything. You know that version by the hour it arrives. Early morning, neutral tone, the name of whoever you'll be meeting written clearly at the top. The second way is the other way. That one tends to arrive in the late afternoon. The tone is still neutral. It's always neutral, because the protocol office doesn't do melodrama, but there's a particular quality to the neutrality, a thinness to it, like the calm surface of water over something deeper. You don't learn to recognize the difference between them in training. You learn it by being there long enough that your body starts making the distinction before your mind catches up. The request that went to Whitmore that Tuesday evening fell into the second category. I know because the duty officer who relayed it told me later that he'd read it twice before passing it on. Not because there was anything unusual in the words, because there wasn't, but because, and this is his description, not mine, the absence of anything unusual was itself unusual, given the morning, given what the corridor had seen. Whitmore received the message, according to the duty officer, with the same quality of composure he received everything. Said understood, wrote down the time, and went back to what he was doing. I wasn't there for the meeting itself. I want to be very clear about that, because this story has been told in more versions than I can count since it began moving through the quiet channels that information moves through in places like that. And in some of those versions, the details have grown in the way details do when a story passes through enough hands. I'm going to tell you only what I know, what I was told directly, by people who were present, and what I was able to piece together from conversations held in the days that followed. The protocol office occupies a suite of rooms on the second floor of the administrative wing. It's not a dramatic space. Nothing in that part of the palace is by design. The rooms that deal with function and procedure are kept deliberately unshowy. Dark wood, practical furniture. The kind of space that communicates. This is where work happens, where decisions are made without ceremony, because ceremony is for the state rooms downstairs, and this is not that. Whitmore arrived at 9 exactly, not 9:02, not 8:58, 9. The meeting was chaired by the Deputy Household Protocol Officer, a man named Hartwell, Gerald Hartwell, who had been in the role for going on 17 years, and whom every long-serving palace interior guard knew by sight and by reputation. Hartwell was the kind of official who gave you confidence purely by the quality of his attention. He listened the way that very few people listen fully, without preparing his next statement while you were still speaking. Present also, the senior duty officer for the East Wing, a woman named Colonel Price, ceremonially titled, not active military, but carrying the same precision in her bearing that the title implied, and 2 other members of the household administrative staff whose specific roles Whitmore either wasn't told or didn't retain. The meeting, as Whitmore described it to me 3 weeks later, in the staff garden on a warm, late April afternoon, did not begin the way he expected. I thought it would be straightforward, he told me. We were sitting on the low stone bench near the east garden wall, the one that catches the afternoon sun. He had a cup of tea. So did I. The garden was quiet midweek afternoon, the function rooms busy, but the outdoor staff areas empty. I'd prepared what I was going to say, he continued. The formal version. I knew the protocol article that applied. I'd looked it up the night before, not because I was uncertain of it, but because if it was going to come up in a formal setting, I wanted the exact language, not my approximation of it. He paused, drank his tea. Hartwell didn't open with what I expected. I waited. He asked me, Whitmore said, how long I'd been at the palace. He looked at me sideways to see if I understood the significance. I wasn't sure I did yet, so I didn't respond. Not walk me through what happened yesterday. Not explain your decision. Not even are you aware that. Just how long had I been there? What did you say? I told him 7 years. 3 at Windsor, 4 at the palace. And then... Whitmore set his tea down on the bench beside him, looked at the garden wall for a moment. He nodded, Whitmore said, like that was the answer he'd expected, and then he asked me something else. Another pause, long enough that I started to wonder if he was deciding how much to tell me. He asked me, in those 7 years, had I ever, in a situation where protocol and a personal directive from a senior member of the royal household appeared to be in tension, had I ever lost that clarity about which one governed? The garden was very quiet. And I said no, Whitmore said, simply without drama. And he said, Whitmore picked up his tea again, turned the cup in his hands. He said that was what he'd expected me to say, and that it was what the East Corridor's record for that post had led him to expect. I sat with that for a moment. That was it, I asked. Mostly, he said. Mostly. He looked at me again, that level gray look. There was a conversation, a longer one, about what protocol does and doesn't permit in different situations, about the role of a guard's judgment in, he paused, choosing the word, ambiguous moments, about what the post exists to do. And Hartwell ended it by saying something. Whitmore looked back at the garden wall. He said, the difficulty with positions like yours, meaning the interior guard positions, the corridor posts, is that the protocol is written for the expected, and you are very often standing in the middle of the unexpected. He was quiet. He said the answer to that tension isn't a different protocol. It's people who understand what the protocol is actually trying to protect, and who can hold that understanding clearly enough that they can apply it even when the exact scenario isn't written down anywhere. The spring sun moved behind a cloud. The garden shifted to a cooler, softer light. And then he said that Whitmore, meaning me, seemed to be that kind of person, and that the East Corridor was fortunate to have that kind of person at its buffer post. He said it the way you'd report a weather observation. Neutral, accurate, not proud of it, not dismissing it. Just placing it in the correct position in the sequence of events the way he placed everything. I thought about what Douglas Richards had said at lunch the day before. Most blokes in that situation, they'd either panic and do something they regretted, or they'd dig in and make it bigger than it needed to be. Either way, there's a scene. There's something you have to manage afterwards. Whitmore didn't give it a scene to be. And I thought, the meeting in Hartwell's office hadn't given it a scene to be either. Because Whitmore had walked in there with a clarity that was so settled, and Hartwell had recognized that clarity so completely, that there was no conflict available to fill the room. The meeting that some of the staff hall had been quietly certain would turn into something significant had instead turned into what? A conversation, a recognition. A quiet alignment between what a man was and what the job actually needed. That's rarer than you'd think. In the days that followed the meeting, life in the East Corridor returned to its baseline rhythms with the same matter-of-fact completeness that characterized most things about palace interior duty. The rotation continued. The light through the tall sash windows made its slow seasonal journey toward the longer, warmer angles of late April. The household functions carried on an evening reception, a morning meeting of the Senior Household Advisory Committee, 2 ceremonial walkthroughs that required the corridor guards to hold their most formal posture for the better part of an hour. The story of the Tuesday morning, the stop, the exchange, the composure, continued to move through the quiet information current of the palace at its own pace. I stopped being surprised by who had heard it. Even people in departments that had no physical connection to the East Corridor had encountered some version of it by the end of that first week. What I noticed was the shape the story took as it moved. In most cases, when a story passes through enough people, it accumulates. It gains detail it didn't have at the source. It gathers drama. The edges sharpen. The pauses grow longer in the retelling. The central figure becomes incrementally more heroic or more transgressive, depending on what kind of story the teller needs it to be. This story didn't do that. It didn't accumulate. If anything, it contracted, stripped itself down. What reached people at the far end of the information current was smaller than what had actually happened, simpler, and, I thought, truer. As if the story were finding, through its retelling, the clearest version of itself. the one that didn't need the extra weight. What reached people at the far end was this. A guard had been asked to do something his post didn't permit. He had said so respectfully, and the person who had asked had accepted that and moved on. That was it. That was the whole story. And somehow, in that stripped-down form, it carried more. I want to tell you about a moment that happened exactly 1 week after that Tuesday morning. Wednesday, mid-morning, the East Corridor on a quiet day. I was at my post near the buffer doors. Whitmore was at his post, 20 meters to my left. The corridor was empty, fully empty, none of the usual passage of household staff or administrative movement, which sometimes happened in that mid-morning window when the morning's functions had concluded and the afternoons hadn't yet begun. In that stillness, the corridor was something different, not the performing corridor of the busy hours or the purposeful corridor of the transit hours, something older, something that predated all the functions and the rotations and the protocols and existed simply as itself, a long reach of pale spring light, the smell of old carpets and wood polish, the very faint sound of the garden outside coming through the window glass. I was watching the light on the far wall. And then Whitmore spoke, not reporting anything, not alerting me to something in the corridor, just speaking quietly into the stillness between us. My grandfather was a policeman, he said. I didn't turn toward him. That wasn't the kind of conversation that needed you to turn toward each other. 31 years, he continued. Same beat, same borough, same square mile of East London. Started as a constable and retired as a constable because he never wanted to move up. He said the moment you moved up, you stopped doing the actual thing. The light shifted slightly, a cloud passing somewhere above the formal gardens. People used to ask him, Whitmore said, why he'd never made sergeant, and he'd tell them. He'd say, I'm a good constable. I know exactly what that means. I know what it asks of me. I know what I owe to it. And I'd rather be excellent at the thing I understand than adequate at a thing I'm still working out. I was very still. I used to think that was a small ambition, Whitmore said. When I was young, I used to think he was selling himself short. Pause. I don't think that anymore. We didn't speak again for the rest of that shift. The corridor resumed its mid-morning quiet. The afternoon functions came and went. The spring light retreated slowly from the tall windows as the day moved toward evening. But that conversation, that brief, unprompted thing that wasn't quite a speech and wasn't quite a confession, stayed with me in the way certain things stay with you. Not because of what was said, but because of what it confirmed. Whitmore knew. He knew exactly what he was. He knew exactly what the post was. He knew what he owed to it and in what order and why. And he held that knowledge so completely that it had become the foundation his life sat on. Stable, settled. Not rigid, there's a difference, and it matters, but settled. The way certain things in very old buildings are settled. Not because they were built to be impressive, because they were built to hold. And in that holding, they lasted. I've thought often, in the years since leaving the palace, and I'll get to my own departure, that's a part of this story too, about what it is exactly that makes certain people suited to certain roles in a way that transcends competence. Competence you can teach. Competence is repeatable. You can write a manual for it. What Whitmore had wasn't in any manual. It was, I think, a kind of deep structural integrity. The same sort of integrity that engineers look for in materials when they're building something that needs to last under variable load. Not hardness, not brittleness. A specific relationship between structure and flexibility, where the thing can bear what it needs to bear without either breaking or permanently deforming. Whitmore on that Tuesday morning in April had been tested, not dramatically, not in the way films test their central figures, just tested, in the quiet, specific way that kind of job tests you when the expected gives way to the unexpected. And he had held. Not because of what he did. Because of what he was. That's the distinction, and it's the one that matters most. The protocol office meeting was closed without action. That was the formal outcome. No notation in the record, no consequential documentation. A meeting convened, a conversation conducted, a meeting concluded. The kind of administrative resolution that produces not so much as a ripple on the surface of palace life. Hartwell, by all accounts, had treated the matter with exactly the gravity it warranted. Not more, not less. The palace had an instinct, institutional, centuries old, for finding the correct weight to give things. Too little weight and you'd created a precedent. Too much weight and you'd transformed a moment of quiet integrity into a spectacle. The correct weight was, this was handled correctly, by the guard. The matter is understood, moving on. That was what the closed protocol meeting communicated to the palace-wide information current, and the current accepted it, and moved on. What it couldn't carry, what the protocol records couldn't capture, and the institutional language didn't have a mechanism for, was the other thing. The thing that had moved through the staff corridors and the lunch tables and the quiet conversations in the garden. The recognition, not of the act itself, not of the exchange in the East Corridor as some act of defiance or some moment of heroic resistance, but of the man, of what the man was and why the palace was better for having him in it. That kind of recognition doesn't get written into records. It moves differently, through different channels, at a different pace. It was still moving, quietly, weeks later. I know because I was still hearing it. If you've never stood a long post in a place like that, in a place where the walls have 2 centuries of sound in them, where the carpets are thick enough to swallow footsteps, where your entire function is to be the stillest thing in a room that is already very still, then it's difficult to explain what the passage of time feels like. It doesn't drag. That's what people assume when they ask about palace duty. They assume it must be mind-numbing, standing there hour after hour with nothing to react to, the same corridor, the same light, the same 1,000 times walked floor. They assume you must be counting the minutes. You're not. You're not counting anything. You exist in a kind of suspended present. The past hour and the next hour have the same quality as the current minute. They're all part of the same thing, the same ongoing act of attention that is also, in the deepest sense, the job. Time in that space isn't something you experience as a sequence of units. It's something you inhabit. I'm trying to describe this properly because it matters to the ending of this story. Because what happened to James Whitmore in the months after that April Tuesday had everything to do with what it means to inhabit time the way he did, and what it means when the thing you've built your inhabiting around begins to shift. The summer of 2018 came in the way that English summers sometimes do, late and sudden, a burst of warmth in late June that felt like a gift after a long, hesitant spring. The East Corridor changed again, as it always did with the seasons. The light became more direct, the windows admitting a quality of afternoon gold that turned the cream plasterwork of the ceiling into something almost warm. The household functions scaled up for the summer schedule. The palace was busier. More movement through the corridors, more passing faces, more occasions for the kind of heightened alertness that interior guard duty required in its more populated hours. Whitmore was still at his post. I was still at mine. The April conversation, the protocol office meeting, the East Corridor exchange, all of it, had moved into the particular category that things move into when they've been fully processed by a community and can now be referenced without drama. It wasn't forgotten. It wasn't something people stopped knowing. It was just settled, integrated. Part of the known history of the East Corridor, like the scuff on the skirting board near the third window from the left that nobody ever quite got around to touching up. Or the way the chandelier at the far end made a sound like a single-held breath when the central heating system kicked on in the winter. We knew about the April exchange the way we knew about those things. It was part of the corridor's texture now. Whitmore himself was unchanged. That's the only word I have for it. Unchanged. Not rigid, not frozen, he engaged, he communicated. He was fully present in every interaction I observed him in, including the ones that had nothing to do with his post. In the staff dining hall, in the break periods, in the small incidental conversations that punctuate the shift hours. He was present. He was human. But the foundation of him was unchanged. Whatever that quality was, that deep structural integrity, that settled clarity, it hadn't been altered by what had happened in April. Not expanded. Not tested into something self-conscious. Not converted into a story he told about himself. It had simply continued being what it was, quietly, the way things continue being what they are when they're genuinely themselves. In late July, I think it was the last week of the month, one of those heavy sky days when the London summer shows its overcast face, and the garden outside the corridor windows looks more English than at any other time of year. I had a conversation with Douglas Richards that I've returned to many times since. We were in the lower staff corridor, heading in opposite directions, and we stopped the way you stop in narrow staff corridors, pulling up short, turning sideways a little, taking 2 minutes in an in-between space. Richards asked me something unexpected. He asked if I'd noticed that Whitmore never talked about leaving. I said I hadn't been thinking about it. Most of the others have a timeline, Richards said, even the ones who are very good at the job. They have a sense of how long they'll be here, a number in their head. You can see it sometimes, the way people are mentally calculating the distance to the exit. He paused. Whitmore doesn't have a number, you can tell. There's no calculation happening. I thought about it. Maybe he's just not a planner, I offered. Richards shook his head. No, he said, it's not that. He plans fine. You see him in the handover briefings. The man is meticulous. He paused again. It's more that he doesn't experience the job as something to get through. He experiences it as the thing itself. The job isn't the path to something else. The job is the destination. I stood with that in the narrow staff corridor for a moment. Is that unusual? I asked, though I knew the answer. Richards gave me a look. Of everyone in this building, he said, I think there are maybe 4 or 5 people I could say that about honestly, and that's being generous. He moved on. I stood there a moment longer. 4 or 5 people out of hundreds. The job as the destination. September. The summer light fading from the east corridor windows by degrees. The season changing again, not dramatically, not the way it changes in more expressive climates. Gently. The quality of the morning light first, then the temperature, then the color of the garden outside beginning its slow recalibration. I had a meeting with my own senior duty officer in late September to discuss my rotation for the following year. Standard review. The kind of conversation that happened annually, where the question on the table wasn't whether you were doing the job, but what shape the job was going to take for the next 12 months. Toward the end of that meeting, my duty officer said something that brought the whole year into a different focus. He said that there had been a quiet communication, not an official record, not anything that would appear in a file from the senior household administrative office. A communication that expressed appreciation for the quality of the East Corridor Interior Guard during the spring and summer periods, not for any single incident, for the overall quality. For what he called, and he read this phrase carefully from the note he'd made, the consistent standard of composure and judgment that the East Corridor interior posts had demonstrated in situations requiring the application of individual discretion. He looked up from his notes at me after reading that. You know what that means, he said. I think so, I said. It means someone noticed, he said, at a level where things don't usually get noticed unless they've been noticed first by someone paying very close attention. He closed his notes. Well done, he said, both of you. I went back to the East Corridor after that meeting. Whitmore was at his post. I was at mine. The September afternoon light through the tall windows had that particular quality I'd come to associate with the early autumn, softer than summer, with a warmth that felt almost borrowed, like it knew it was temporary. The corridor was quiet, the kind of quiet that sits comfortably. That doesn't demand filling. I thought about what Richards had said. The job as the destination. And I thought about Whitmore's grandfather, the 31-year constable. Same beat, same borough, same square mile. I'm a good constable. I know exactly what that means. I know what I owe to it. And I thought about a thing that I hadn't been able to articulate all year. Not quite. A thing that had been circling the edges of my understanding since April. Since the moment in the East Corridor when everything had been still, and I'd watched a man respond to an unexpected moment with the kind of clarity that doesn't come from training. It was this. We spend a significant part of our lives, most people in most kinds of work in most kinds of life, working out who we are in relation to what we do, trying to align those two things, trying to get the person and the role to fit each other well enough that the gap between them stops producing friction. It's harder than it sounds. Most people manage something like a reasonable fit, close enough. The person and the role approximate each other well enough that life functions without too much structural loss. But there's usually a gap, a space between what you are and what the job needs that you're constantly, quietly working to close, not because you're not suited to the work, but because the alignment is never quite perfect and keeping the gap managed takes energy. Low-level, mostly invisible energy. The background hum of someone who is doing a job rather than being one. Whitmore had no gap. That was what I'd been trying to name all year. The man and the role were the same thing, not because Whitmore had made himself into a guard, but because whoever he had always been, whatever that core of him was, that settled, clarity-native, structurally integral self, it fit this role the way the right key fits the right lock. Not by force, not by effort, by nature. And when you encounter that, genuinely encounter it, not in the romanticized version, but in the actual lived reality of it, it's remarkable. It is genuinely, quietly remarkable. November came. The East Corridor went back to its winter light, that gray, thin morning quality, the gold frames dimming, the carpet losing some of its depth of color, the chandeliers doing more work. I was in that corridor for the last time in the middle of November. My own transfer came through in late October, a move to a different post, a different building, a different set of walls. My choice, partly, and partly the natural movement of things after 11 years. The point where the accumulation of time in one place starts to feel like something completed rather than something ongoing. My last shift in the East Corridor was a Tuesday. I don't know if I chose that deliberately or if it was just how the rotation fell. I like to think the building arranged it. It was quiet. It was a Tuesday in November, late in the month, and the East Corridor had its winter self fully in place. The thin light, the hush, the weight of the air that was somehow both ancient and completely familiar. Whitmore was at his post. I was at mine. For the last time. At the end of the shift, in the handover period when the next rotation comes in and you give them the debrief and the notes, I did a thing that I hadn't planned, and that felt a little strange even as I was doing it. I walked to Whitmore's post. Not urgently, not dramatically. Just walked the 20 meters of East Corridor carpet between us slowly because I wasn't in any hurry. Because this was the last walk I was going to take on that carpet. He watched me come. When I reached him, I held out my hand. He looked at it for a moment, looked at me. Then he took it. The handshake was what you'd expect from Whitmore, firm, brief, no unnecessary flourish. "Transfer," I said. "I know," he said. "Douglas told me." "Right," I said. There was a pause, the appropriate kind. 7 years you've been at this post, I said. 8 now, he said. 8 years, same corridor, same station, same 40 meters of carpet and pale plaster and winter and spring and summer and autumn. "Aren't you," I started, and then I stopped because I wasn't sure how to ask the question honestly without it coming out wrong. He waited. "Aren't you ready to be somewhere else?" I asked, "after 8 years?" He looked at the corridor. His corridor, in the way that a corridor becomes yours when you've stood in it long enough to know its every light and shade. "I'm not sure readiness is the right frame for it," he said. "What is?" He thought for a moment. The new rotation was coming in at the far end. We had maybe 3 minutes. "I'm useful here," he said. "I know this post. I know what it asks. I know what the unexpected looks like when it's coming." He paused. "Being useful at a specific thing, in a specific place, in a way that actually matters, that's not something I'm in a hurry to trade away." The new rotation was close now. "What if they offer you something better?" I asked. He looked at me. "Better than what?" I didn't have an answer for that, not a satisfying one. "Take care of yourself, Thomas," he said. "You too," I said. And I walked to the end of the East Corridor for the last time, through the double doors, down the staff passage, out into the November cold. I didn't look back. Not because I was being dramatic about it, just because there wasn't a reason to. The corridor would continue. The light would shift through its seasons. The chandeliers would do their slow work of making that space into the thing it was. And Whitmore would stand at his post, being what he was, being useful at a specific thing, in a specific place, in a way that actually mattered. I've told this story a few times now, in different forms, to different people, and the question I get asked most often, more than questions about the April exchange, more than questions about the protocol office meeting, is this. Do you think he was right to say what he said the way he said it? And every time I get asked that, I have to think about it properly before I answer, because it's a question that deserves a real answer rather than the easy one. The easy answer is yes, clearly yes. He held the protocol. He communicated it with courtesy, no lasting harm was done, and the institutional response confirmed that the situation was handled correctly. The real answer is more complicated, and I think more interesting. The real answer is that whether he was right depends on what you think the job is actually for. If you think the job of a guard is to execute commands as they come, from whatever direction they come, at whatever rank they come from, then Whitmore's Tuesday morning in April was a deviation. A decision he made in a fraction of a second to prioritize one form of authority over another. And decisions like that are supposed to go upward, not get made in the field. But if you think, as Hartwell seemed to think, as every long-serving person in that building seemed on reflection to think, that the job is actually to protect something. Not a person, not a building, but a system. A set of relationships between authority and responsibility, between role and person, between what is expected and what the unexpected requires. If you think the job is to hold that system steady when it's under pressure, even quiet pressure, even pressure that comes from an unexpected direction, then Whitmore didn't deviate at all. He did exactly the job. He held the system steady. He was the still point in a moment that could have moved in several directions, and his stillness, his clarity, kept everything in its correct place. I left the palace in November of 2018. I've been in a different kind of work since then, not a dramatic change, nothing that makes for a better story. Just a different application of the same basic skills in a different setting. The hours are more regular. The walls have less history. The light is ordinary. I don't miss the palace. Or rather, I miss it in the specific way you miss a thing that was genuinely itself. Not the glamour of it, not the proximity to significance. Just the specific quality of a place that has been what it is long enough to become it completely. The way the East Corridor was itself at 6 in the morning in November, the thin winter light, the hush. I miss that. I heard about Whitmore through the occasional word from former colleagues for a couple of years after I left. Same post, same East Corridor, the rotation continued. The seasons moved through the tall windows, everything the same. And then I stopped hearing, the way you stop hearing about a place when enough time has put enough distance between you and it. Not a bad stopping, not a stopping that worried me, just the natural quieting of information channels between one life and another. What I know is this. There was a man, he stood a post. He did it for 8 years at last count, probably more now, in a corridor that most people who visit the palace never see. He understood exactly what the post was for. He understood it clearly enough that when an unexpected moment arrived and clarity was the only resource available, he had it. Fully, immediately, without cost to anyone, including himself. He did not think of this as heroism. He would have been baffled, I think, to hear it described that way. For him it was Tuesday. It was his post. It was the thing the post asked of him, arriving in an unexpected form, and the thing he did was the thing the post required. That's all. And somehow, and I've thought about why this is, many times over several years now, and I think I understand it a little better each time. That simplicity is what makes it worth telling. Not the drama of it, not the confrontation of it, not the hierarchy and protocol tension of it, which is what the gossip version of this story always fastened on. The simplicity. A man who knew what he was, who knew what his post was for, who, when those two things were tested against something unexpected, held. Just held. That's it. That is genuinely, quietly, completely it. There are people in the world, not many, but some, who are so exactly themselves, so completely native to what they are and what they do that being around them produces a particular quality of calm. Not because they're peaceful necessarily. Not because they're easy or uncomplicated, but because the gap between what they are and what they do is zero. Because they are doing what they are, not approximating it, not getting closer to it. Being it. That calm is real. It's not charisma, it's not confidence, it's something quieter and I think far rarer. It's what the East Corridor had in James Whitmore. It's what the East Corridor will keep in whoever comes after him, whenever the rotation eventually changes. Because that is also what the palace is for, not just the function rooms and the ceremonies and the apparatus of state, but this, the quiet interior, the man at the post, the column in the room. The still point, standing long after the chandeliers have gone dark and the tourists have gone home, and the spring light has long since turned to winter. Still standing,